It was the second Friday of October 1988, one of those Appalachian mornings that comes in gold and cold at once. The hills around Harlan County still wearing their summer green beneath the first burn of autumn color. The air sharp enough to make your breath visible, but warm enough by 8 o'clock that the kids showed up at Millbrook Elementary without their jackets on. Mrs. Carol Ostrander had been teaching 4th grade for 11 years and had never once lost a permission slip. Which is the kind of thing you remember about a person when everything else gets complicated later. She had organized this trip herself. The Harlan County Nature Preserve, 40 minutes up Route 9, a trail walk, a picnic, and back before the dismissal bell. 22 children between the ages of 8 and 10, the kind of children whose names you learn because they remind you of your own. She had called the preserve office twice that week to confirm the trail conditions. She had counted the permission slips herself on Thursday evening, sitting at her kitchen table with a cup of instant coffee. The yellow school bus, District 14, number 47, driven by a part-time driver named Gerald Pratt, who also worked Saturdays at the county feed store, pulled out of the Millbrook Elementary parking lot at 9:13 in the morning. Mrs. Ostrander sat in the first row behind Gerald, her attendance clipboard on her knee. The children in the back rows were singing something from a movie. One of them, a boy named Daniel Fry, had brought a bag of Halloween candy 2 weeks early and was already sharing it. A girl named Lacey Hobbs had her face pressed to the window, watching the road. They never made it to the preserve. By noon, Millbrook Elementary's principal, Douglas Ware, had called Route 9's only gas station, the Nature Preserve, and Harlan County Dispatch. None of them had seen the bus. By 2 in the afternoon, Douglas Ware had called every parent. By 5, the entire county knew, and by the time darkness fell over those hills on the evening of October 14th, 1988, 22 children and 2 adults had vanished without a single witness, without a single piece of evidence, without a single explanation that anyone in Harlan County could begin to make sense of. But that is not a story about a bus that got lost on a rural road. That is a story about what can be hidden, deliberately, systematically, and for an almost impossible stretch of time when the people who know the truth decide to keep it. And it would take 35 years. A land survey drone operated by a graduate student who was looking for something else entirely, and a discovery so specific and so damning that it shut down a county commissioner's office the morning the news broke to finally begin answering what happened on Route 9. But to understand what was found, you first have to understand what was lost. Because before any of this, there were 22 children who deserved to grow up. Millbrook, Kentucky, in October 1988, had a population of just under 2,000. It sat in a fold between 2 ridgelines, the kind of town where the elementary school and the post office were on the same block, where the hardware store had been owned by the same family since 1957, and where you could still get a milkshake at the lunch counter of Denny Pruitt's drugstore on Main Street for $1.25. The Millbrook Fall Festival had taken place every 3rd weekend of October for 40 consecutive years. People came from the next 3 counties over for the apple butter. It was Reagan's America. The Berlin Wall was still standing. Gas was under $1. Most homes had 1 television and no answering machine. When something went wrong in Millbrook, people heard about it the way they had always heard about things, 1 phone call at a time, spreading street by street until every light was on and every front porch had someone standing on it. Mrs. Carol Ostrander was 34 years old. She had grown up in neighboring Bell County, married a man named Ed who worked at the County Water Authority, and moved to Millbrook when she got the Millbrook Elementary job. She had no children of her own. She had told Ed she was saving all her good mothering for the classroom, which was the kind of thing she could say without a trace of irony and have everyone believe her, because you could see it the moment you watched her with a child. She made every student feel like the most interesting person in the room. She kept a jar of hard candies on her desk and a list on the wall of every student's birthday, and she never once missed one. She wore lavender on Fridays, always. Her students called it Lavender Friday and looked forward to it. The 22 children ranged from Marcus Webb, the tallest 8-year-old anyone had seen, who wanted to be a veterinarian, to Penny Carlisle, who was turning 10 the following week and had been talking about the field trip as a pre-birthday adventure for a month. There was Daniel Fry with his premature Halloween candy. There was Lacey Hobbs with her face to the window. There were siblings, Kyle and Anna Marsh, who sat together in every situation because their mother had asked Mrs. Ostrander please keep them together. They're calmer that way. There were children from the farms on the ridge, children from the houses on Orchard Street, children from the small cluster of newer homes out by the water tower. That morning, Daniel Fry's mother, Ruth, had stood at the end of her driveway and watched the bus pass on its way toward Route 9. She waved. Daniel had pressed his candy bag to the window and waved back. Ruth Fry had gone inside, poured herself a second cup of coffee, and thought about what to make for dinner. She would not see her son again for 35 years. At 9:13, the bus left Millbrook Elementary. At 9:41, a driver on Route 9 named Earl Patton passed what he would later describe to investigators as a yellow school bus traveling north at normal speed. Earl was heading south. He did not see anything unusual. The road was clear. The morning was bright, and the bus had its lights on the way school buses do even in daylight. That is the last confirmed sighting of District 14 bus number 47. At 10:15, the Harlan County Nature Preserve recorded no arriving school group in its visitor log. The preserve's trail attendant, a retired teacher named Bud Hollis, waited at the gate until nearly 11. He assumed there had been a cancellation and no one had thought to call. He unlocked the trail and went about his morning. At 11:52, Principal Douglas Ware called Gerald Pratt's home number. No answer. He called the preserve. Bud Hollis told him the bus had never arrived. At 12:04, Douglas Ware called Harlan County Dispatch. He was gone. They were all gone. No crash on Route 9, no bus in a ditch, no report of any accident on any road in Harlan, Bell, or Leslie counties that morning. 24 people had driven up a state highway and stepped off the edge of the world. The search began before dark and continued for 8 days. State police, county deputies, volunteers from 4 surrounding counties. They walked both sides of Route 9 for 17 miles in either direction. They searched every logging road, every turnout, every creek crossing along the route. Helicopters from the Kentucky State Police flew the ridgelines twice. Underwater recovery teams checked the deepest sections of Clover Branch Reservoir, whose western edge touched Route 9 near the 12-mile mark. They found nothing. No tire tracks leaving the road. No physical evidence of any kind. 24 people and a 40-foot yellow school bus had traveled north on Route 9 on a clear October morning and ceased to exist. By day 3, Harlan County Sheriff Dwayne Millis had identified 2 lines of investigation. The first was mechanical failure of some kind. A brake failure, perhaps, that had sent the bus off the road at a point where the vegetation was thick enough to conceal it from aerial view. The second, which he spoke about only in his private notes, was that Gerald Pratt had driven those children somewhere deliberately. What nobody said out loud, not for years, was the third possibility. The one that required you to consider who else was on Route 9 that morning. The one that required you to consider that the land on both sides of Route 9 between mile marker 11 and mile marker 16 was privately owned by a single company, and that the man who owned that company had, 3 weeks earlier, lost a bitterly contested county zoning dispute that had blocked him from developing a section of ridge property. A dispute decided, in no small part, by Ed Ostrander, Carol's husband, who sat on the County Water Authority Board and had testified against the development's proposed drainage plan. Nobody said it out loud. And that silence had a weight that would only grow heavier over the years. The lead investigator assigned by the Kentucky State Police was a 39-year-old detective named Alan Sharp, out of the Harlan Post. He had been on the force for 14 years, had worked kidnappings before, and had a reputation for not letting go of things. His partner described him as someone who would go home, eat dinner, and then go back to the office at 9 at night because he'd thought of something on the drive home. He was the right man for this case in every way that mattered, and was missing only one thing, which was any physical evidence whatsoever. Within the first 10 days, Alan Sharp had developed a profile on Gerald Pratt that was thorough and ultimately useless. Gerald was 47 years old, twice divorced, no criminal record, no debts beyond the ordinary kind, no political affiliations, no associations with anyone who had any reason to harm a school group. He had driven for District 14 for 6 years without incident. 3 different people described him as quiet, helpful, the kind of man who showed up early. His sister in Louisville told Alan Sharp that Gerald would no sooner hurt a child than fly to the moon. The second suspect came from an anonymous tip called in on day 4. It named a farmhand named Bobby Dees, who had worked several properties along Route 9 and had a prior arrest for aggravated assault in 1979. Alan Sharp spent 11 days on Bobby Dees. He had an alibi. A work crew of 5 men could place him 30 miles away that morning. He was eliminated. The anonymous tip was never traced. Meanwhile, Ed Ostrander sat in the family home on Sycamore Street and answered questions and gave blood and cooperated in every possible way, and told anyone who would listen that his wife would never have let anything happen to those children. He drove Route 9 every evening for 6 weeks, pulling over at every wide spot, walking into the woods 20 yards, turning around, walking back. He kept a yellow legal pad in the car. He wrote down everything he saw. The families held a vigil on day 30. They lit 24 candles on the steps of Millbrook First Baptist. The pastor said he believed in miracles. The parents held hands in the cold and stared at the flames. Ruth Fry held Daniel's last school photo in one hand and a candle in the other and stood there until long after the other candles burned out. Detective Alan Sharp attended the vigil. He stood at the back. He did not say anything because there was nothing useful to say, and he was not a man who spoke without purpose. After it ended, he drove to the state police post and sat at his desk until 2 a.m, reviewing a geological survey of the land adjacent to Route 9. He was looking for something he couldn't name yet. He just knew it was there. Every case on this channel represents weeks of digging through records, verifying facts, and piecing together real lives that deserved better. If you want us to keep uncovering the truth behind stories like this one, please take a second to like this video, subscribe, and drop a comment telling us where in the world you're watching from. Your support is what makes this possible. Now let's get back to Harlan County. The house on Sycamore Street had been sold twice since Carol vanished. By 1997, Ed Ostrander had moved away to Lexington, then to somewhere out of state. Nobody blamed him. The children who had been in Daniel Fry's class were in their late 20s now, some of them with children of their own. Daniel's mother, Ruth, still lived in the same house at the end of the same driveway. She still had a photo of Daniel on the mantel above the fireplace. School picture, 1988. The red sweater she had bought him that September. His gap-toothed grin. The reward poster in the window of Denny Pruitt's drugstore had faded to the color of old newspaper. Nobody took it down. Alan Sharp had retired from the state police in 2004 at age 55. He kept the case files in a plastic tote in his garage on Metal Road, outside of Harlan. His wife said she had long since stopped asking him to throw them away. He'd drive out to Route 9 once or twice a year, usually in October, usually on or near the 14th. He'd park at the wide spot near mile marker 12, walk the shoulder, look at the tree line, come back to his truck, sit there a while. In 2012, a documentary filmmaker from Louisville spent 2 weeks in Harlan County researching the case. She interviewed Ruth Fry, 3 other parents, Alan Sharp and Douglas Ware, who was in his late 70s by then and still carried the weight of that Friday on his face. The documentary aired on a regional cable channel and was watched by approximately 40,000 people. It generated 200 calls to the Kentucky State Police tip line. None of the tips led anywhere actionable. The land between mile markers 11 and 16 on Route 9 had changed hands twice. The development company that had owned it in 1988 had dissolved by 1996. Its owner, a man named Virgil Caston, had died in 2009 of a stroke in a hospital in Nashville. He left no confession, no documentary evidence of any wrongdoing, and an estate that was divided among 3 adult children who had each long since moved out of Kentucky. The case was cold. The case had been cold for 20 years. And the thing about cold cases, the thing Alan Sharp knew in his bones from decades on the job, is that they rarely break from the outside. They break from inside the evidence that was always there, waiting for someone with the right tool to look at it the right way. Then, in the fall of 2023, a graduate student at the University of Kentucky, named Priya Chandrasekaran, began a land survey project using drone-mounted LiDAR imaging along the Route 9 corridor. She was mapping erosion patterns in an old growth section of Harlan County Forest for her thesis. She was not looking for a school bus. She was not thinking about the Millbrook case. She had grown up in Lexington and was 24 years old, born 5 years after the children vanished. What she found on a Tuesday afternoon in October, 35 years almost to the day, was a dense rectangular anomaly 56 feet below the surface of a collapsed limestone sinkhole on the east side of Route 9, between mile markers 12 and 13. The anomaly was 42 feet long, 8 feet wide, and approximately 6 feet deep. It had the profile of a large vehicle. It had been there long enough that the tree roots of 2 mature oaks had grown partially around it. It had been there since 1988. Priya Chandrasekaran downloaded the LiDAR data at her apartment in Lexington that Tuesday evening. She opened the anomaly file 3 times, each time expecting to see something that would explain it as natural geology. It didn't look natural. She called her thesis advisor at 10:30 at night. He told her to document everything she had and call the state police in the morning. She did not sleep. Detective Alan Sharp, retired, received a call from his former partner at the Harlan Post at 7:48 on Wednesday morning. He was 60, 9 years old. He had driven Route 9 6 weeks earlier, on the 35th anniversary. He was told about the LiDAR anomaly. He said nothing for a moment. Then, he said, quietly, "I always knew it was there." He was in his truck and on Route 9 within 2 hours. The process of confirming what was in that sinkhole took 11 days. Heavy excavation equipment had to be brought in. The site was secured by Kentucky State Police and the FBI's Louisville Field Office, which had retained jurisdiction over the original case. The anomaly was indeed a vehicle. It was indeed a school bus. Its registration, recovered from a corroded metal plate still attached to the chassis, matched District 14 bus number 47. The vehicle had been driven into the sinkhole, a natural geological formation that would have been invisible from the road in 1988 unless you specifically knew it was there, and the entry point had been deliberately collapsed and covered with fill material. A forensic geologist would later confirm that a second vehicle, consistent with a heavy construction dump truck, had been used to push earthfill over the site. Inside the bus, investigators found the remains of 24 individuals. They found a bag of Halloween candy. They found a clipboard with an attendance sheet. Ruth Fry was not told by telephone. Alan Sharp drove to her house on a Thursday afternoon and knocked on the door himself. He stood on her porch and told her what they had found. She reached out and took hold of his arm, and the two of them stood there on that porch for a long moment without speaking. Then she said, "He kept the candy." And Alan Sharp said yes, they had found it. And she nodded and looked out at the driveway and said, then he was thinking about sharing it. Even then, that was all she said for a while. The investigation that followed moved quickly once there was something physical to work with. Forensic analysis of the earthfill material and the dump truck tire impressions preserved in the compressed soil beneath it led investigators to a specific vehicle. A 1987 Ford F-750 dump truck that had been owned and operated by Caston Development LLC in 1988 and sold for scrap in 1993. The truck was gone, but the bill of sale still existed in a storage facility in Nashville belonging to the Caston estate, and it was signed by a man named Raymond Hollis, no relation to Bud Hollis, the preserve attendant, who had been Caston's site foreman from 1985 through 1991. Raymond Hollis was 73 years old and living in a retirement community in Brentwood, Tennessee. He did not answer the door when FBI agents knocked. They entered under a warrant. He was in his living room. He had, investigators would later determine, been watching cable news coverage of the Route 9 excavation for 4 days. He had not eaten. He had not slept. When the agents came through the door, he looked at them and said 4 words that were recorded by the body camera of the lead agent and would be played in open court 18 months later. I did some things. The investigation that followed produced a 47-page statement from Raymond Hollis, given over 6 days of debriefings, in which he described in full what Virgil Caston had ordered, what Caston had paid, and what Raymond Hollis had done on the morning of October 14, 1988. Caston had used a second driver, a man already deceased by 2023, to force Gerald Pratt's bus off Route 9 using a logging truck that had been positioned at mile marker 12. Gerald Pratt had managed to keep the bus on the road until the sinkhole, which Caston had scouted in advance. The details of what happened after that were in Raymond Hollis's statement and are part of the sealed court record. Virgil Caston had done it because he had lost a zoning dispute, because a school teacher's husband had testified at a county hearing, because a man with money and access to machinery had decided, with a calmness that no one who later read the case file could fully comprehend, that the most direct solution was the one he had chosen. Raymond Hollis was charged with 24 counts of second-degree murder, criminal conspiracy, and obstruction of justice. He was convicted on all counts in March 2025 and sentenced to life in prison. He was the last living person with direct knowledge of what happened. The sentence was the only justice that remained. In the weeks after the discovery, the families of the 22 children and 2 adults were brought together in Millbrook for the first time in decades. Some of them had stayed. Most had scattered. They came back to a town that had carried the wound for 35 years and had never fully found a way to heal it. The Harlan County Nature Preserve, where those 22 children had been headed, created a permanent memorial garden on the trail they would have walked. 24 stones, each one engraved with a name. Mrs. Carol Ostrander's stone is at the entrance. It reads, "She wore lavender on Fridays." Daniel Fry's stone has a small carved candy wrapper on its face. Ruth Fry chose it. She said it was the right thing. She said she wanted anyone who came to that garden to know who he was before they knew what had happened to him. The case changed Kentucky law in two specific ways. A 2024 statute now requires independent geological surveys of all reported disappearance corridors within the first 6 months of an open case. A second provision expanded the rights of victims' families to access active investigation files. The provisions are named collectively as the Millbrook Act. The Kentucky State Legislature passed them unanimously. What does it mean that a man could do this, cover it this completely, and die in a hospital bed with no consequence, no reckoning, no moment where the truth touched him? What does it mean for the families who spent 35 years in the particular grief of not knowing? The grief that cannot fully land, cannot fully move, because there is always the possibility of an answer just ahead. What does forensic technology that didn't exist in 1988 now owe to every cold case still waiting in evidence boxes across this country? These questions don't have clean answers, but they are worth sitting with. Where were you when you first heard about the Millbrook case? What detail from this story has stayed with you most? And if you had to name one change beyond the Millbrook Act that you think this case demands, what would it be? Justice came for Daniel Fry and Carol Ostrander and all 22 children after 35 years. Stories like theirs remind us that truth, however buried, however deep, always finds its way to the light. If you believe that too, subscribe so you don't miss the next case. More solved cold cases are waiting in the description below. Thank you for watching.